Now, one of the major books of the second wave was Betty Friedan, which was a liberal feminist position. And her argument, Betty Friedan was an interesting woman. She was a journalist, and she did something quite profound in the 1950s. When she wanted to know about women, she actually asked women, which you have to understand in those days, you didn't do that. If you wanted to know anything about women, you asked men, right? They were the experts on women. So she really, on that level, did something that was important. She spoke to women and she said to them, you know, what are your lives like? And she often did it at the kitchen table in the suburbs. And what she found was everyone kept talking about the problem and the issue. And she actually called it the problem with no name. What it was she was finding that these women who were had moved from the sort of inner city and were now the upwardly mobile middle class white women, moved into the suburbs, were completely alone, isolated, didn't have any extended family around them, and were incredibly depressed. And of course, this was the beginnings of putting women on all sorts of drugs, women drinking. At that time, they started doing recipes for sweet alcoholic drinks because they knew that women were turning to drink as well, just because they were so depressed and couldn't stand it. And they didn't have any language. Just think when you've got no language to talk about your life. So that's the good thing she did. Now, what she said is the only way for a woman, as for a man, is to find herself, to know herself as a person, is by creative work of her own. So what she said is to women, many of whom were college educated, she was speaking to, is go out and get a job. You need to get out of the house and go and get a job, join the workforce. Now, this is where the divisions began, because really she was speaking to only white middle-class women living in the suburbs. That was her audience. And her belief that the answer was individual women entering the workplace ignored the fact that poor white women and women of color had always worked, right? They didn't have to go back to the workplace. For them, the workplace was not a source of liberation for these women. It was actually a source of oppression. So she really didn't get the race issue. She also was quite naive, as were many liberal feminists in that time, was that the workplace would meet the needs of women with children. She also believed if we put more women in the workplace, we'll be more women-centered. Well, how did that work out for us? She had no analysis of capitalism or racism, because she did not understand really the ways in which white upper middle class women probably could get a foot in the door, but other women were not going to be. They were going to be relegated, as we'll talk about, to the more service industries. She also didn't understand the dexterity of patriarchy and capitalism to co-opt feminism, which is exactly what they did. And actually, for those who live in the United States, there's an excellent 10-part documentary on Playboy, which looks at the history of Playboy, which I would definitely recommend. It blows the lid off. It shows Hefner to be a pimp, a rapist, the lot. And he was a huge figure in co-opting feminism. He gave money to the ACLU, to the National Organization of Women. So he was very central, Hefner and Playboy, in co-opting feminism. Now, the big issue here is she didn't understand that the empowerment, and I'm using the term empowerment here because she used a similar word. She did not talk about liberation. She talked about empowerment, which is a very different concept. She knew the empowerment of the white. She didn't get it, but she was sort of subtextually that the empowerment of these white women was based on the low paid labor of women of color and white women. Why? Because there was no daycare. Right? Who was going to look after the kids? Who was going to do all the shit work of the home that women have always been relegated to? Of course, in the United States, it was mainly women of color. And in fact, what we know is that the empowerment, or women going out and making money, white women, was actually on the backs of poor white women, and especially women of color. So you have this beginning of not understanding the intersectionality of capitalism, sexism, and racism. And I want to just put a plug out there for the concept of intersectionality, because I know in many radical feminist circles, I see a lot of eye rolling. Actually, radical feminism was the first to really talk about intersectionality. They might not have used that term, but they understood absolutely critically that you cannot make generalized statements about all women, because life is mediated by not only the fact that you're part of a sex-based oppression class, but also depending on your race and depending on your economic class. So they were very clear in the early days. And if you read some of the original books of the 1960s from radical feminism, Sisterhood is Powerful, Woman Hating, This Bridge Called My Back, all of these great books, they really got that you have to understand women as a sex-based class mediated by other forms of oppression. So I really think it's important that we pull back intersectionality from the liberal feminists who have turned it into an identity politics thing, and we put back the material reality of women's lives.